Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz, and the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton, each will control 20 minutes. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Utah.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We're about to come up on a very important date regarding World War I, and this bill, sponsored by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, H.R. 6364, is a very worthy undertaking that the Congress, I believe, should enact. And so, in the spirit of that, I'd like to actually recognize and yield such time as he may consume, to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe.
Gentleman's recognized.
Appreciate the gentleman from Utah yielding time. Madam Speaker, Frank Buckles was the epitome of an American hero and a man who would do anything for this great United States of America. This is a photograph of him recently taken after he joined the United States Army. Frank Buckles wanted to be in the United States Army. He volunteered. No one would take him because, you see, he wasn't 18. He finally continued to lie about his age, convinced a recruiter he was 21, and at this age of 16, he joined the United States Army in the Great World War I. He wanted to get to France as soon as he could, and so he volunteered to be in the ambulance service. And what he did when he got to Europe was rescue and pick up other doughboys in Europe out of those trenches and get them take them back behind American lines so that they could be taken care of their wounds. And he also picked up many of our Americans, 114,000 to be exact, that died in the Great World War I. He was allowed or was able to come back to America alive. He made it through the war, although many, as I mentioned, did not. Many Americans, when they came home from the Great War over there, as Cohan said, died of the flu they picked up in Europe. In fact, many of them, a great number of them, died from the Spanish flu, almost as many as died in Europe itself. Frank Buckle then went to work, and during his work, it took him to the Philippines. But when he was in the Philippines, the Japanese invaded in World War II, and Frank Buckles again was captured by the Philippines, by the Japanese in the Philippines, and put in a prisoner of war camp for 3.5 years. He was about to be executed, and the Americans came and liberated the camp, and he, along with the other prisoners of war, came back to America. Frank Buckles then went back to West Virginia, where he worked his farm and drove the tractor until he was 107, Madam Speaker. It was his decision and his life goal that he would be instrumental in helping build a memorial on the Mall for all of the veterans who served in the Great World War I. I met him in 2007, and this project has been going on now for 5 years to try to get approval to build this memorial for all veterans of the World War I on the Mall, almost as long as the war took. And so he came to Washington, D.C. a few years ago. This is a picture of him that was taken recently before he died at the age of 110 at the D.C. Memorial on the Mall. What that is a monument and a memorial to all of the veterans from the District of Columbia that served in World War I. And I went with him to this memorial where we talked about expanding our honor of all veterans and having a memorial for everybody in the Great World War I. And so that was his goal, and he worked with many members of Congress on this issue. Unfortunately, he didn't live long enough. Oh, he lived 110. He didn't live long enough to see the memorial created. He was the last, Madam Speaker, the very last doughboy American that lived in the Great World War I. They're all gone, every one of them. So it is up to us, members of Congress and the public, to speak for them and honor them on the Mall right across the street, as would be appropriate. It is, in the Mall we have 3 of the great wars of the last century, 3 of the great 4 wars, that we honor. We honor those in World War II, the Korean War, and Vietnam. Now it's time to honor all of those who served in the Great World War I. I must compliment a little school down in Texas, Creekwood Middle School, and Jan York, who works there. It was the project of 8th graders years ago to find all of the World War I survivors and do a history project on them throughout the world from all countries. And they did a project on, of course, Frank Buckles as well. In fact, we were able to get him on the phone, and the 8th grade class at Creekwood Middle School on one of his birthdays sang happy birthday to him. Now, those kids who are seniors in high school now will be able to see, hopefully, this memorial built and the approval of it to be built on the mall. But I want to thank her and her 8th graders for the history project concept of delving in American history in depth and finding out what has happened in our great American nation. I also want to thank my friend Emanuel Cleaver from Missouri for his help on this legislation, and the gentlelady from D.C., Ms. Norton, also Subcommittee Chairman Mr. Bishop, and the Committee Chairman Doc Hastings as well. And it is important that we pass this legislation, get this legislation passed that will do three things: build a mall, build a memorial on the mall. It will also set up a commission to honor World War I as this nation is approaching the 100th year, and it will also recognize, which my friend Mr. Cleaver will talk about, the work of the museum and the national work of the World War I Memorial in Kansas City. It's time we pass this to honor those great World War I veterans. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back.
Madam Speaker, reclaiming my time, I'd like to yield such time as he may consume to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Huizinga.
Gentleman's recognized for such time as he may consume.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate my friend from Utah for doing that, and I'm glad we could keep this photograph up. Here's how I got involved and engaged in this. It's very personal. Actually, the man who took this photograph, David DeYoung, is a constituent and a friend of mine back from West Michigan. He was actually part of a project that went out to try then to photograph all the remaining World War I survivors, traveled to Europe, traveled to Australia, and then had met Frank Buckles along the way. And had gotten to know him very well. I unfortunately was not able to meet him in person, but attended his funeral at Arlington, where we said goodbye as a nation. And I can tell you that it was his desire. It was Frank's desire, David's desire, his family's desire, my desire, and I think now finally this body's desire to properly say thank you. The other reason why this is very personal and very important to me is I get to talk about a man named Bill Huizinga. Not me, Bill Huizinga, but my grandfather, Bill Huizinga, who happened to fight in World War I. He was part of a group called the Polar Bears, men who were chosen from Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan because they figured they'd be used to the cold, and they sent them all the way up around Norway to Archangel, Russia, to fight in an undeclared portion of World War I. In fact, Grandpa Bill was there after Armistice Day, where British, Canadian, and American troops remained well into the summer of that following year, into that spring of the following year, after Armistice. And it wasn't until much, much later that we were actually even officially recognized as being part of that. But I can tell you, having one of my prized possessions is my grandfather's old doughboy helmet that hangs in our family's home. And it's just a fitting, timely thing that we finally say thank you. We finally recognize this group of men who fought a terrible war, who fought a war that so many had hoped would be the war to end all wars. And unfortunately, we know that isn't the case. But I'd like to commend our friends across the aisle, the gentlelady from the district and the gentleman from Missouri for working on this, and led by my friend from Texas, Mr. Poe, to get this done. This is an important statement for us and a fitting tribute to that generation. And Frank, we thank you for your service and for all those families. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlewoman from the District of Columbia.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, and may I say that we will not only miss you seeing you occasionally in that chair. I will especially miss you, and I know I speak for my colleagues on both sides of the aisle when I say we will especially miss you sitting in the chair as chair of the Financial Services Appropriation Committee and as a member of this body, which you have so graciously served. I ask permission to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
And I yield myself such time as I may consume. Madam Speaker, I rise in support of this important legislation. H.R. 6364 establishes a commission to ensure the suitable observation of the centennial of World War I. It further provides for the designation of a memorial to the service of the members of the United States Armed Forces throughout the United States who participated in World War I, and it finally protects the District of Columbia World War I Memorial on the Mall. This bill had to do three things, and I want to express my appreciation to all of the members who were party to the agreement that finally resulted in this bill. My colleague, Mr. Poe of Texas, Mr. Cleaver of Missouri, Mr. Grijalva of Arizona, for working with me to preserve the District of Columbia World War I Memorial in particular. The bill that is before us, Madam Chair, is an example of what can be done when members work together to achieve resolution of their individual concerns. Earlier this Congress, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, introduced H.R. 938. It would have, among other things, nationalized the D.C. Memorial by designating it as the District of Columbia and National World War I Memorial. Now, we were all in agreement that there should be a suitable memorial on federal land as we now approach this extraordinary anniversary in 2014. But of course, I had to oppose altering the integrity of the D.C. War Memorial. That memorial was built with not one federal dollar, but with the blood and treasure of D.C. residents, including funds from school children. Of the more than 26,000 D.C. residents who served in World War I, the 499 who died, more than the number from 3 states, have their names individually carved on that memorial. Our memorial is deeply symbolic of the historic and continuing concerns of district residents, particularly our veterans, who continue to serve without equal representation in the Congress, equal rights as citizens, and equal local government control. I am very happy this afternoon to report that H.R. 6364 protects the integrity of the D.C. Memorial but goes further. It meets the concern for a World War I memorial here for all veterans, and that's the concern that Mr. Poe spoke of, and it meets Mr. Cleaver's concern and the concern of members from Missouri, like you, Madam Speaker, for a designation of that extraordinarily beautiful memorial as a National World War I memorial. The bill establishes a commission to ensure a suitable observance of the centennial of World War I and designates memorials to the service of members of the United States Armed Forces in World War I, including a National World War I memorial. H.R. 6364 protects the D.C. Memorial because it complies with the provision of the Commemorative Works Act that prohibits a new memorial from, and I'm quoting the Act, interfering with or encroaching on an existing commemorative work, end quote. And the bill goes further by saying that the site of the National World War I Memorial on federal land may not, quote, infringe upon or adversely impact the District of Columbia War Memorial. This preservation is, of course, critical to D.C. residents who deserve to have a memorial dedicated to their veterans. As I might mention, every single state has as to World War I veterans, because at that time, most Americans thought it preferable to have memorials in their own states, and so each and every state has a World War I memorial. Today, no one thinks that you have had a memorial to your veterans unless it's on federal land. It has always been our position that a national memorial dedicated to all Americans who served World War I should be located in the nation's capital. And I have been committed and remain committed to working with my colleagues to find suitable locations in the District of Columbia for a national World War I memorial. I'm happy that H.R. 6364 allows for such a memorial, does not interfere with the D.C. War Memorial, and appropriately commemorates the beautiful memorial in Missouri. Madam Speaker, I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this bill and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves the balance of her time. Gentleman from Utah?
I'd like to reserve the balance of our time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from the District of Columbia?
Madam Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from Missouri who has worked so hard on this bill and has been so creative and diligent and committed. I yield to the gentleman such time as he may consume.
Gentleman from Missouri is recognized for such time as he may consume.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We are here today in an unprecedented show of bipartisanship with this piece of legislation. H.R. 6364 is the product of both sides of the aisles working together to do what is right to honor the memory of our veterans. I especially want to thank Representative Ted Poe for his efforts in bringing this bill to the floor today, and Representative Eleanor Holmes Norton for her work on the legislation. And of course, I'd also like to thank Majority Leader Cantor for his support along the way. Frank Buckles, who was on the stage of the Liberty Memorial in Kansas City just 4 years ago during the Veterans Day program, was the last surviving veteran from World War I, and he was from the state of Missouri. Unfortunately, he passed away during the drafting of this very bill. However, even with Mr. Buckles' passing, our commitment remains strong, as it is never too late to demonstrate our appreciation to the veterans of the Great War for their service and sacrifices. This bill will honor that service by establishing a centennial commission that would see to it that the 100th anniversary of the Great War did not slip away, as many things slip away in this place where there is sometimes more partisan bickering than necessary. Not only does this bill serve to honor the memory of our great veterans, but it stands, I think, as a symbol that bipartisanship and cooperation are indeed possible. The United States formally joined the war in April of 1917, and during that time, more than 4.7 million Americans served. Now it's our job to serve their memory. The 5th District of Missouri, which I proudly serve, includes Kansas City, the home of the Liberty Memorial, and this is the Liberty Memorial. And I think it's always important for people to see it, because I think when people hear the Liberty Memorial, if they're not from the area, if they've not visited Kansas City, they may see something that is, just some little something. You can see this in terms of the Kansas City skyline. And I would also take this opportunity to remind people this is the largest city in the state of Missouri. This Liberty Memorial is one of the great treasures of our community and our state. And it sits atop the World War I Museum. In 1919, the people of Kansas City raised $2.5 million, mainly through children, in 10 days to create the Liberty Memorial. The dedication ceremony was the only time in history that the Supreme Allied commanders were together in one place. The dedication of this memorial was held on November 1st, 1921. In 1994, during my first term as mayor of Kansas City, the museum added greater majesty to the site with the construction of a municipally funded restoration project. The Liberty Memorial operates the only American museum solely dedicated to preserving the objects, history, and personal experiences of a war whose impact still echoes today. This bill would also redesignate this facility as a World War I memorial and museum and give it the distinction it richly deserves. Madam Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Utah.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to yield as much time as he may consume to the distinguished colleague from the state of Kansas, one of the co-sponsors of the bill, Mr. Yoder.
Gentleman from Kansas is recognized.
I thank the gentleman from Utah, and I thank the Speaker for recognizing me. I want to echo the comments of my friend and colleague from Missouri across the Kansas City border, who so eloquently described the majesty and beauty of the World War I Museum and Memorial that we have in Kansas City. It is truly a national tribute. And to spend time today on the House floor to take a moment to pay tribute to the men and women who sacrificed in World War I and to designate this World War I Museum the National World War I Memorial is a wonderful moment that I have a chance to take part in. And I want to thank my colleague from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, and my colleague from Texas, Mr. Poe, and others who have put so much time and work on this legislation. As has been said, this is 2014 will mark the 100th anniversary and centennial anniversary of the Great War. The Frank Buckles World War I Memorial Act establishes this Centennial Commission to ensure that those who served and sacrificed to promote the ideals and freedom in this World War are properly honored for their bravery, and to honor the World War I hero Frank Buckles that Ted Poe and others have so appropriately described today. It's sometimes difficult for Kansas and Missouri, as Madam Speaker knows, and my colleague from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, knows, to agree on many things, but it's a nice opportunity for a Kansan to come down and join with my colleague from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, and others to take this moment to honor the World War I Museum and Memorial in Kansas City, which does such a great job of paying tribute to the service and sacrifice of the men and women in World War I. I actually had a chance recently to join Mr. Cleaver on Veterans Day when we addressed veterans from multiple wars to talk about the service and sacrifice and really the legacy that has continued on for generations in this country of serving our country and many people paying the ultimate sacrifice. And so to have a chance to take part in that on Veterans Day with Mr. Cleaver was great, and to be here today to recognize the Kansas City Memorial and Museum as the National World War I Memorial is a great opportunity. And I want to encourage all of my colleagues to take a time to go out to Kansas City and to see this museum. It is top-notch quality. I think you all will be very impressed, and I'm pleased to support this legislation today and to recognize that museum and memorial, and to ultimately recognize the service and sacrifice of the men and women who served in World War I. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from the District of Columbia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I am not only pleased with the outcome with this bill, I am proud of the way it was achieved. This bill about war dead, about war heroes, had emotional content, but the members reasoned together and in a collegial fashion agreed upon an outcome that is satisfactory to all of us. There are going to be 3 ways in which World War I heroes are remembered. For sure, here in the District of Columbia with the existing memorial, now in St. Louis, in Kansas City, with the majestic memorial that is there, and of course this bill authorizes a second memorial here in the District of Columbia, the nation's capital. The members cooperated and achieved the kind of resolution that we hope will, during this lame duck session, be the model for how we reach the ultimate agreement this year and start off next year. Thank you very much. And without any more speakers, Madam Speaker, I yield the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from Utah.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I appreciate Ms. Holmes Norton and Mr. Cleaver for this very bipartisan approach to something that should live in the memories of all Americans, the sacrifices that was given in this country to provide so much for us. As you know, the United States entered World War I in April of 1917 to support Great Britain, France, Belgium, and other allies. It was the first time that American soldiers went abroad in defense of liberty against the foreign aggression. More than 4 million men and women served in uniform during the Great War. There were 375,000 American casualties during World War I, including 116,516 fatalities. The upcoming centennial is an opportunity for the United States to honor the sacrifices of these great Americans. H.R. 6364 creates a World War I commission to commemorate the upcoming centennial. The bill would establish a memorial in the District of Columbia to honor those who fought during the Great War. I'd also note that there are no federal funds that are attached to the building of this. H.R. 6364 was favorably reported by unanimous consent in the Committee on Natural Resources last week. And I again want to thank Congressman Poe from the state of Texas for introducing the piece of legislation, the numerous individuals on both sides of the aisle. It's a very bipartisan approach, and I would urge all of my colleagues to support this piece of legislation. And I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 6364 as amended? Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed. And without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, the title is amended. The chair lays before the House a communication.
The Honorable the Speaker, House of Representatives. Sir, pursuant to Section 3B of the Public Safety